Greetings everyone and welcome to our Office 365 ExchangeCon breakout session on Stairway to Heaven, Best Practices for Hybrid Deployments. We're very pleased to have eNow as a sponsor and presenter for this online gathering of some of the leading experts and vendors within the MS Exchange and Office 365 professional community. My name is Roger and I'll be the event moderator, and I have a few quick housekeeping items before I introduce today's presenter. We will be using the Twitter hashtag Office365EXCHCON, that's Office365EXCHCON, to share information and feedback throughout today's ExchangeCon event. So please join in that conversation. We'll also be using that Twitter hashtag to share links to the subsequent breakout sessions. All participant lines are muted, but we encourage you to use the chat panel to submit any questions or comments you have during the presentation. We will be addressing questions at the end of the session, and we will conclude in time for those of you who will be joining the next breakout session that will begin immediately following this one. Our presenter for this session is Michael van Hornenbeck. Michael is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master and Exchange Server MVP from Belgium. He specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, and a bit of Link. He is a member of the UC Architects, and in addition to that, he frequently speaks at various international conferences and writes articles for several tech websites. You can follow Michael on Twitter at MVANHORENBEECK or through one of his blogs on michaelvh.wordpress.com and www.pro-exchange.be. Well, thank you for joining us today, Michael, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. When you do not plan your migration to the cloud, things go wrong. When things go wrong, your email system will be disrupted. When your email system is disrupted, your CIO gets embarrassed. When your CIO gets embarrassed, you lose your job. When you lose your job, you have to cancel your family vacation to Disney. Don't cancel your family vacation. Prepare for your migration to the cloud. Now, obviously, this is an exaggeration of what could happen in the real world, but truth is, I see this every day and I hear it a lot. As a consultant, I'm mainly helping, organizations move to the cloud, setting them up with a hybrid deployment, and I see that many people think that, deploying a hybrid configuration or moving to the cloud is easy, and even more of them think that, once they're in the cloud, they're done. That was it. But unfortunately, this isn't always true. It's not because you have migrated to the cloud or you're in the process of migrating to the cloud that your life will be easier. It will be different, and depending on what path you choose and how you prepare, that might be easier. So we're here today to share some of the tips, some of my tips, what I use, the tools that I use for hybrid deployments, and we'll see how you can make your life easier. So basically we'll go over a few scenarios and we'll see what the challenges are with migrating to the cloud. So what are these challenges and what can you do about them? Then we will talk about some of the tools that I use to make my life easier because, doing a lot of hybrid deployments, making sure that I can rely on the correct tools is very important to me. We'll also take a look at what a typical hybrid deployment unfolds, what it actually is, and what the different key areas are where you should focus on. And then afterwards, we went through the migration, we'll share some tips on how you can manage a hybrid deployment, what it entails to manage a hybrid deployment, and what tools you can use for a hybrid deployment. So let's start and have a quick look at some of the deployment challenges. The biggest thing, and I'll probably repeat it a few times throughout the session, is that you need to plan and plan thoroughly, because planning is about 75% of the work involved with a hybrid deployment. Unfortunately, all too often I see people rush in and start running the hybrid configuration wizard, which might end you up in issues afterwards, and that is definitely something you don't want to. So when we take a look at the planning process, there are some key areas where you need to focus on, and the first one is the source where you are migrating from. This means that you need to take a look at what is your current messaging system, what does it look like, and then need to question yourself, where do you want to go? Is it a full cloud deployment? Are you going to go in a full hybrid deployment? Are you going to stay hybrid, or are you just using a hybrid deployment to move to the cloud? So these are all kind of questions that you need to ask yourself, because depending on the source environment that you're in, which could be an Exchange 2003, even though it's almost out of support, but this could also be Lotus Notes or another cloud vendor like Gmail or Yahoo, they all limit your options, or they all open up options for setting up a hybrid deployment or the type of migration that you're doing. So a hybrid deployment as such isn't really a topology that you just put down and say, hey, I've got my hybrid deployment. Typically it is a in-between step that you use to move to Office 365, and maybe you'll keep the hybrid deployment for a long time, or you'll keep it forever, but still the goal for a hybrid deployment is to eventually move you to Office 365. Now, when you are, for instance, running Exchange 2003, and we'll get into that into more detail in a few slides, then obviously there are things that you can and things that you cannot do. So it's very important to understand what your options are depending on the source system where you're migrating from. Secondly, you need to take a look at the size of your environment. Now, the size, depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer, because, the standards in Europe are different than the ones in the United States. But given that you are a large environment with a few thousand seats, then obviously your approach to a hybrid deployment will be different from an organization which just has a few seats or maybe a few hundred seats. So there's a discrepancy that you need to take into account as well, because the size, immediately impacts the bandwidth that you need. It impacts, how long it takes to move a single mailbox, or, for instance, I prefer to move 10 mailboxes of 1 gigabyte than one mailbox of 10 gigabytes, just because it gives me that added complexity. But again, we'll dive into that into detail in a little more. Now, any of these two, the source and the size, and especially the size, will give you some or more options from an identity management point of view. Obviously, when you're running a hybrid deployment, you'll be running dsync, because that's a prerequisite that you cannot get from under. But there are times where you might decide not to use dsync right away, and that you're just going to play a little bit with Office 365 before you're diving into the hybrid deployment. If that is the case, then there are several ways into getting user accounts into Office 365. You could make them, create them manually. You could use a script, to automatically get them in Office 365, and then afterwards you use dsync to soft match these items to the objects that are already in Office 365. But all in all, the size, the type of your environment, Active Directory on premises, whether or not it's in a healthy state, will determine how and how long it will take to implement the identity management solutions. And then last but not least, we've got the provisioning part, which I kind of tied into the identity management piece. Because they are tightly integrated, you first need to have those objects in Office 365 before you can federate them with ADFS or even use password sync. So these are kind of the 4 building blocks that go into the planning phase of a project, which deserve a lot of attention. So it's very important that you know what your environment contains, that you have a broad view of what is in your environment, and for that, let's have a little look at the planning for the source. So, as I said, it's very important that you identify the source that you're moving from, and obviously, if you're running if you're the messaging administrator, you pretty much know what you have. But more from a limitation point of view that I'm talking right now. Why is that? Well, as I said earlier, there are a lot of companies who are still running Exchange 2003, and even though that they can move to Office 365 and they can even have a hybrid deployment, they can only do so when they are using Exchange 2010. The reason is that Exchange 2003 on premises doesn't coexist with Exchange 2013. So that kind of limits your options because, even though Exchange 2010 Spec 3 can perfectly work with the current Office 365 version, the hybrid configuration wizard in 2010 is still a little bit limited over Exchange 2013. So preferably, if you have the option, you'd want to move to 2013 first before going hybrid. But if you want to move to 2013, if you're still on Exchange 2003, you need to first move to 2007 natively before you can even do that, which means, a double hop migration, which means additional effort, which means more time that you need to move to Office 365, and sometimes you're budget constrained, you're time constrained. So that's very important to understand what you can do there. Obviously, if your goal is to end up in Office 365, well, there are other options. You are not, required to go hybrid. You could use the built-in tools that are available, like the iMigration, but that's very limited. Even though it supports pretty much any on-premises system, you can only move email. There's no option to move tasks and so forth. The cutover and staged migration might be a good alternative, but they don't scale very well. Even though they support up till a few thousand users, I have found these type of migrations to be very limited towards flexibility, the ability to choose how long it takes. So from a planning point of view, even though there are great tools, they don't offer the same flexibility as a hybrid deployment does. So again, sometimes you are required to take one of these tools or even go through a third-party tool to get your job done. But whenever it is possible, whenever you can do it, the hybrid deployment with its remote mailbox moves, which we will be talking about later in this presentation, is very, very flexible. So then again, what is another important part, as part of the size which I talked about earlier, is what data you're going to move. There is a size, obviously, in the amount of mailboxes that you have, but there's also a size in terms of data storage, data footprint. You could have a few gigabytes, which is okay, but you could have multiple gigabytes, hundreds of them, even terabytes in data living in your messaging system. And then the question becomes, how are you even going to get that moved to Office 365? So that is very difficult. It's very important that you get a view of what your data footprint is. What kind of data do you have in your environment? Is it large mailboxes with a low amount of items? Is it large mailboxes with a high amount of items, which results in a lot of items but not that big? And then where is your data located? Isn't it in a single data center? Is it in multiple data center? Is it across the world? Do you have options to reduce that amount of data? So it's very important to understand that from a migration batch point of view, because it will allow you to better make decisions on how large a batch will be, which mailboxes you're going to move together to Office 365. Because mailboxes that you move together are mailboxes that will retain their permissions to one another. But if I have permissions to someone else's mailbox and you move that other mailbox without moving my mailbox to Office 365, then obviously I'll lose some of the functionality and I'll start complaining. So again, from that point of view, you need to know and you need to kind of figure out, lay out for yourself how your data is organized in your environment, and doing so without insight is very difficult. So what I typically do in such scenarios, and I will show you in a second, is I pull out some reports. So one of the reports that I like using, as you will see, is a report which gives me an overview of which mailboxes I have in my environment and the size they have and the amount of items that are in the mailbox, because that gives me a good idea, okay, what's the type of data that I'm currently working with. It gives me a rough estimation for myself, how I should tackle a hybrid migration, how large my batches can be depending on the bandwidth. And from that point of view, I can continue and actually try and find additional information about those mailboxes. Another thing that I often use is the mailbox permissions report, because, as I said earlier, it's important that you keep mailboxes together that share permissions to one another. So this here, for instance, clearly shows you, that for a given mailbox, who has access and what type of access to that mailbox. So inventorizing this is a work that could take up a lot of time, and there are basically two approaches. Either you don't care, but you'll have end users not complaining, ultimately leading to the CIO who gets embarrassed and gets unhappy, and maybe ultimately leading to you getting fired, which you don't want to. Or the alternative is, do some research up front, do 75% of the work here, and make sure that your mailbox moves are happy afterwards. And then thirdly, another interesting report that I use is to see which messages or which mailboxes in my environment contain messages over a certain size. Now you might wonder, why is that even, important? Well, as you might know, is that in Office 365 there is a message size limit of 25 megs, which means that any message larger than that amount of, or larger than that size won't get moved over to Office 365. So from a user point of view, that is a bad experience. I have data, I get moved to the cloud, and then some data is left behind because it's too big. If I don't tell the end user upfront what will happen, they will be unhappy. So by using this report, I can actually see, hey, that mailbox from Paul Garrett, for instance, he has a mail somewhere in his mailbox. I don't know which one it is for privacy reasons. That's about 46 megabytes in size, maybe a little less. So I probably should tell him, hey, you know what, Paul, there is an issue. Well, we're going to run into an issue with your mailbox when we're moving it. You've got items larger than what we allow or what Microsoft allows. So here's a filter that you can use in Outlook, and then could you please, move it to a PSD file, or I can do it for you if you want to, prior to the migration, so that whatever happens, he still has access to that item. Because believe it or not, if you're not telling them, sooner or later they're going to need that item, and they're going to come down on you because it's not there. So again, very important to keep that in mind. So let me quickly move back to the slides. Another thing that's directly related to the size of the data is, the bandwidth that you have available. It's very important that you understand that, if you've got a 10 meg line, it'll take longer for you to move than you've got a 100 meg line or even a gig line. So depending on the size, make sure that you check with your provider if you can burst the bandwidth for a while up to a higher amount of speed for a month or two, or even permanently, because afterwards people will be connecting to the cloud. But typically moving mailboxes is a burst type of traffic, so you don't need the same amount of bandwidth to sustain operations in Office 365. Now, a hybrid deployment is, as I explained earlier, something with many, many moving parts. It's no longer only about Exchange. Exchange definitely is the bigger part of it, but there's a part Active Directory involved, DirSync, making sure that it's healthy, that it's synchronizing correctly. And there's the networking part, the connectivity part between your on-premises environment and whatever is in the cloud is extremely important, because any latency that you have might negatively impact your data migration, might impact how your users perceive how messages are received, how their Outlook operates. So you kind of need to have a feel of how that relates to your environment. On top of that, you don't always have control about all of these things, because Office 365 is living in the cloud, which means it's publicly available, which typically means, unless you're restricting access through ADFS, that your users will be able to connect to their mailbox from pretty much anywhere. And while you can control the bandwidth in your office and how it's used, you don't always have access to whatever they're using at home, or even if they're traveling for work. So, from a planning point of view, we touched about on the most important parts, and we could go on for hours and hours and even fill an entire day on this. But it's very important that you keep in mind these 4 or 5 areas that we touched upon. So let's move to the implementation phase. And let's see what it entails to actually go in and deploy a hybrid migration or a hybrid deployment for Exchange 2010 or 2013. As you will see in the next slide, and don't get scared by what I'm going to show to you, there is a lot of things involved. As you can see here, a hybrid architecture has many, many moving parts. Kind of in the top in the middle of the screen, you see the organizational relationship. Well, this is, a organizational relationship between your on-premises environment and your Cloud Exchange environment. It ensures that you can, for instance, share freebie information, and that all of that interaction is covered, cross-premises mail tips. Then a little bit lower, you have the hybrid mail flow, which ensures, that mails flow from one end to the other one and that they are being seen as internal email to one another. The last thing you want to do or want to have is that I send a message to one of my colleagues who's living in the cloud and that message is received by his Outlook, but it seems like I'm an external recipient instead of, his colleague sitting next to him. And that's what the security in hybrid mail flow, TLS encryption actually takes care of and makes sure that some headers are preserved. So these two are very important because as soon as one of both fails, that is going to have a negative impact on how your hybrid deployment works and how your users will perceive that. Even if hybrid mail flow fails, your users won't notice it immediately, but it won't take long for them to notice that a mail they've sent to one of their colleagues, isn't getting there in time or isn't getting there at all. And that's when they start calling, and that's when you should get worried, or you should actually get worried before. Another thing that's very important is, the entire identity federation, identity connection part, where we have DirSync sitting in between Active Directory and Azure AD, which then talks to Office 365, to kind of, synchronize the objects from your on-premises Active Directory and make sure there's a similar global address list in your on-premises environment and in Office 365. The reason I said similar is because depending on how your on-premises environment looks like, you might have some differences, but typically, DirSync is there to ensure there's a unified experience, whereas ADFS then is kind of the delegation for authentication, and there are many ways into your ADFS environment. You could have users connecting from on-premises, connecting through the internet. You could even have, Office 365 connecting to your ADFS proxy. So, the image says it pretty much all. There are a lot of flows, a lot of connection types, a lot of ways of interacting between your on-premises and your online environment, which makes it a little bit, hard to oversee at first. But all in all, it's less difficult than it looks like. So from a supportability point of view, the main thing I want you to take home is that, if you're still running Exchange 2003, then basically you need to have Exchange 2010 Service Pack 3 on premises if you want to go hybrid with the current version of Office 365. That's kind of the only limitation. If you're using 2007, then make sure that you have Service Pack 3, and I think it's Update Rollup 10 installed along with an Exchange 2013, preferably the latest update, cumulative update, and you're good to go. Obviously, if you're running 2010 Service Pack 3 natively, there's no need for you to upgrade to Exchange 2013. However, 2013 has some pretty neat features for a hybrid deployment, by which I actually mean that it's, it has a better hybrid configuration wizard. It does a much better job at logging whatever is happening in your environment. Has some advantages over 2010, which I think are pretty cool for a hybrid deployment. And whenever I can, all other problems set aside, I use Exchange 2013, especially for these things. But that doesn't mean that 2010 Service Pack 3 doesn't work. So it kind of comes and goes with whatever you have at that time. Now, hybrid deployments typically are all about decisions, and more decisions. We did 75% of the planning, and during that planning phase, you probably made all of these decisions. But when we take a look at what these actually entail, there's the ADFS piece. Are you going to, go highly available with ADFS? If so, how are you going to do that? Are you going to go a hybrid ADFS deployment and maybe leverage, Azure to put some of your ADFS servers over there? Or are you keeping everything on premises? And if you're doing so, are you deduplicating the servers? Meaning, are you putting two servers in? Are you going to use, ADFS server proxies? And if you're doing so, how about your internet connection? Because, it's great that you might have 4 on-premise ADFS servers, and, if one dies, you still have 3 to service your users, which should be more than enough. But if you only have a single internet connection and that one goes out, then you still are running into issues, even though you might have 4 servers on premises, because if your users cannot get to your ADFS server, they're not able to log into their mailbox, and that means to them there is a service outage, even though Office 365 is running perfectly fine in the back. So, using ADFS, which I very much like, has its own set of issues. It's very important to monitor that it's still working, that connectivity is working, and connectivity, by which I mean everything, end-to-end, your internet connection. So it might be worth, exploring what it costs to have a backup line in place, or maybe put it in a second data center and then use something like a geo load balancer to make sure that, your AFS is highly available and available all the time, especially if you want your email to be available as much as possible. DuraSync, on the other hand, there is no need to make it highly available, by which I mean, it's an appliance-like setup. You set it up and it works fine for a while. If it breaks down, there's no big issue. People won't be noticing issues right away, at least. So you have got some time to set up a new DuraSync server, which takes over the role of the primary DuraSync server, which failed previously. So is there a necessity? No. Can you put a second server in sort of hot standby? Yes, you can. It will just, make sure that if the first DuraSync server fails, it will come up, you need to do some manual interactions, and then it will come up and take over the role of the server that failed. Another thing to be wary about is like the hybrid Exchange servers that you have been using. Do you have a single one? Are you going to use multiple ones? To me, it's very obvious, just as ADFS, it's very important to have that, organizational relationship hit the Exchange server every time. So you don't want to take out that Exchange server for maintenance and, have to tell your users, oh, by the way, FreeBusy won't work for a while, Mailtips won't work for a while. You just want to be worry-free. So ideally, you need at least 2 hybrid servers on premises, which are able to, to take a load of one another, and serve as a backup in case one needs some maintenance, and given that you're running service, they will need maintenance at some point in time, especially if you're running in a hybrid deployment and you're installing, let's say, Exchange 2013. Whenever there is a new cumulative update coming out, it's okay for you to wait a few weeks before you deploy it. That's more than okay. But you are required to update. So it's not that Microsoft tells you, oh, you're still on CU1 whenever they will be CU6 in a few months from here, maybe. No, they will actually require you to be at the latest CU update, or maybe run one behind in order to remain supported. So it's very important that that you stay up to date. And being in the cloud is, a moving train which doesn't stop, and you need to catch up with that train. So that's very important. Last but not least, executing the migration. It's very important that you do a pilot. A very good pilot, a very thorough pilot. You need to pick the users by hand, preferably. Make sure that you have some good use cases, some of your most demanding users, and then move them to the cloud, and then repeat that process. Get feedback from them. What was good? What was bad? What could have been better? And then kind of improve the process until you've got a hang of it. And once you see, okay, well, I just did a batch of users. None of them complained. None of them had really issues. Then you have got an approach which you can use on the majority of your other users. And as I said earlier, make sure that you mind some of the limitations like the cross-premises permissions, which kind of defines who gets into the cloud first. Now, looking at the typical deployment process, first of all, you'll deploy Exchange, by which I mean you make sure Exchange on premises is ready and good to go to update the certificates, the configuration, and that it's ready to deploy the hybrid configuration afterwards. Once that's done, you configure single sign-on. It's optional. Well, it's kind of required, but you typically deploy ADFS. After that's done, you go on with DuraSync, because DuraSync needs to be up and running and working perfectly before you can go hybrid. So assuming that this is done perfectly, you configure certificates, by which I mean your Exchange web services need to have an external certificate. AutoDiscover needs to have an external certificate and work. So they need to be published and will need to have a correct certificate. Once that's done, enable the MRS proxy, which is the mailbox replication server proxy on your web services virtual directory, because we're going to need it later on to move mailboxes. And once you've gone through those five-step process, you can actually run the hybrid configuration wizard, which in case of Exchange 313 will take care of the rest. It will set up the organizational relationships, make some configurations changes back and forth, and once that's done, you're actually ready to either change the MX records if required, and that kind of depends on the scenario that you chose, but definitely you'll end up in a hybrid deployment which bridges your on-premises organization with Office 365. Now, once that's done, make sure that the environment is ready, that the Exchange server is configured properly, and validate that you have that. Now, how do you validate that? Well, there are some tools that I typically use, amongst which are the Exchange Remote Connectivity Analyzer, and there's a blog post when you click the URL later when you get the slide deck, which kind of walks you through the process, which the steps are that I typically use to make sure that whatever I set up a few moments ago is working fine, and that everything I will do on forth from there is going to be okay. So that's very, very, very important as well. And obviously, maybe the most important part here is not really the technical stuff, but also make sure that everyone who is on board and who needs to manage the environment is ready and properly trained, because Office 365 isn't entirely the same as running an Exchange server on premises. So there are some new skills that you need to master, and make sure that everyone's on par with that. So from a hybrid mailbox move, there's a little misunderstanding sometimes here. You're not pushing your data to the cloud, but you're actually pulling it in through Office 365. So how does that work? Well, typically when an administrator issues a move request, that move request gets initiated in Office 365. It will then make an inbound connection over the internet to your Exchange Web Services virtual directory and talk to the mailbox replication service through the MRS proxy. We'll actually say, hey, I've got a move request here initiated by that administrator, and here are his credentials. I need the data for a certain mailbox. And it will then start pulling in the data from that mailbox. Obviously, depending on the size of the environment and the size of the mailbox, that might take a little while. But once the mailbox is synced into Office 365, it will issue, a write update for that recipient, so that the recipient on premises gets changed from a user's mailbox or a user mailbox into a mail-enabled user. Because yes, obviously there is a difference, and that way the mailboxes that remain on premises will immediately notice, oh, look at that mailbox kind of changed, that recipient changed. And once that's done, the move actually completes fine, and you can move forward with our mailbox moves. Important part here, the most important part here, understand that it's an inbound connection and that you're pulling data out of your environment. At no point in time you're pushing it out. So for the firewall guys out there, it is indeed an incoming connection on port 443 on your web services virtual directory, which isn't all too new, because that's typically something you needed before to make Exchange work externally, as well if you wanted to free busy lookups and so forth and so on. But very important to understand that from a networking point of view as well. So we've been talking a little bit about planning, deploying hybrid, and all that that it leaves us with is the tips for living in the cloud, because we've been moving to the cloud all along during this presentation, and we're now halfway there, or maybe we're like 75% down the road, and you're wondering, what's life like in the clouds? Well, I can tell you, living in Office 365 or living in a hybrid deployment, it has its own set of challenges. It's different. It isn't harder. It's different. Again, there's a lot of moving pieces. As you saw earlier, we've got the organizational relationships, hybrid mail flow, ADFS, DirSync, all these new pieces that you need to monitor. So it's no longer only about Exchange. And maybe you don't care about some of them because it's another team that needs to look out for them, but still, they all work together, and one piece that isn't working correctly could affect another one somewhere in an entirely different silo. So the question is, what do you have to monitor, and how do you even monitor those cloud components? Because obviously you can't go in and deploy agents in Office 365. You don't have access to those data centers, and it's good that you don't. Additionally, the complexity of the environment, as I described earlier, and a lack of experience can become a problem. I've seen companies rush to the cloud because they were told that it would be easier, and then end up in a pile of mess because they didn't know how to handle, what to do, what they could or couldn't do. So for them, that was a really horrifying experience. So it's very important that know up front where you're getting yourself into. And typically, some of the things that we see in such case is, certificates that expire. If they do it for your AFS server, it stops working. If your Exchange certificate expires, then obviously Auto Discover won't work, or remote mailbox moves won't work. And I've also seen certificates which were valid but weren't from one of the supported CAs from Microsoft, and even that could cause issues. So make sure that you have a good certificate from a good CA, and typically you're good to go, and monitor that that they don't expire. Make sure that your single sign-on is working, but you need to sign in regularly, make sure that it's working, that it's still highly available. Or I saw times not so long ago even that FreeBusy stopped working all of a sudden, and it took me a while to get to know what the issue was, but apparently there was an issue with the Microsoft Federation Gateway, which caused them to lose some metadata for the Federation trusts, which you set up as part of a hybrid deployment. And yeah, that could get you into trouble, because this time, it wasn't your environment that caused the issue, it was something caused externally, but still it affected quite a lot of hybrid deployments or other type of organizational relationships. What I also saw or come across regularly is third-party filtering tools being used for mail flow, which strip off the internal header, which I talked about earlier, and then as such, people aren't recognized anymore as being internal when mailing one another. So there's a lot of troubleshooting that you need to do to make sure that the header is preserved, that you don't do filtering, and that actually basically you need to send emails from your storage environment directly to Office 365, and the other way around, it needs to come into Exchange without going through any filtering previously. And then, as I said, the moving train is something a lot of companies struggle with as well. If you go into the paradigm of updating regularly, you should be fine. But it is so that once you get on board with Office 365, you need to make sure that your operating system is patched regularly, that your Outlook is patched regularly, that even your Exchange servers are patched regularly, maybe even more regular than you're used to right now. So if you make that jump into the hybrid configuration, make sure that you're aware of this and that you're ready for that as well, because the thing you don't want to is end up with a stale environment which urgently needs upgrading because half of the functions aren't working. Microsoft will continuously roll out new features in the cloud, which might require you to be on the latest and greatest cumulative update they have available. Who knows? So from a troubleshooting point of view, here are some pointers. There's obviously a lot of things that you can do, but the hybrid configuration log files, especially in Exchange 2013, are great. You should definitely take a look at the federation information. There are some test commands that you can use. Same goes for the organizational relationship. And you could troubleshoot connection issues with your networking team. So that are kind of the 4 areas where I hang around in when I see hybrid hybrid issues or issues in a hybrid environment. Now, today's sponsors, they have a tool called Mailscape for Exchange Online, which kind of does that all for you. They've been doing it since December 2012. They've been heavily invested in hybrid deployments, and I'll show you some of the things they have in their tool which might make your life easier and will actually make your life easier. So remember in the beginning of the session I used some of the reports. Well, the reports obviously came out of Mailscape. They have bunch of reports here for Exchange on premises, which help you gain understanding of how your environment works and what data you have in your environment, who has permissions on what mailboxes. But once you're moved to Office 365, they also have a bunch of reports which can help you gain insight into what's happening in Office 365. So as you can see here, there's a bunch of reports here which run against Office 365 and give you that same feeling as the one that you had on premises. So that's definitely a good thing. From a monitoring point of view, as you can see here, we have a lot of things that that are being monitored. First of all, there is the networking point of view. They're making connections. They're making sure that connections to Exchange Online are working. So, for instance, the networking ports, they make a connection of port 25, 443, the common ones to the Outlook Office 365.com endpoint, which is where your clients will be connecting to. But they go a step further. They test the login portal. They also test the endpoint for DirSync. They test the ADFS endpoint Microsoft is using, just to make sure that that is covered as well, because the last thing you want to do is only do half work and just stay with the endpoint for your users, because that might be up and running, but if the one for ADFS is down for some reason, well, yeah, then probably you won't be able to authenticate, and even though your users might be able to connect to an endpoint, they won't be able to authenticate and won't be able to get their data. Another thing that they monitor here is DirSync and ADFS. So from a DirSync point of view, they're taking the very pragmatic approach, syncing an object to Office 365 and making sure the changes they made to the object are actually well perceived in Windows Azure AD. There's also the password sync feature they take a look at. So as soon as that is in place, they'll monitor the password changes and report or throw an alert as soon as the password change didn't go through, which gives you that immediate feedback that you're looking for, that proactive feedback, because obviously you don't want to be sitting in a chair and caught off guard when they start calling you and telling you, hey, there's an issue, I changed my password, it doesn't work, or hey, I can't connect to my mailbox anymore. You want to be proactive about this. Same goes for ADFS. They do the ADFS login tests, so they test the endpoint that it works, they fetch the metadata, and then they do the different login types, the passive authentication, the active authentication, to make sure that all of that is working. And to kind of conclude the overview of the tool, there's also the part of the organizational relationships, which, as you can see here, is in a failed state, where they check the organizational relationships. They issue the test organizational relationship command and then parse the data to see, hey, did we get a token from the MFG? Were we able to get the hybrid federation FreeBSD information? And if it doesn't, they'll throw a warning. So it's very good, or a very good tool to be proactive about. And this being said, let me get back to the slides and ask Roger if there's any questions for today.
Well, that was a wealth of insights and information, Michael, and we do have questions as I anticipated, so we'll dive right into those. First one is, what is the difference between password sync and ADFS?
Oh boy, that's a big one. No, honestly, ADFS is the syndication of authentication, which means that when you issue an authentication request, you'll actually send your credentials over to Office 365, which will then contact your ADFS infrastructure and ask them, hey, the credentials I have here, are these the correct ones? Are these the ones that that validate against whatever you have in your Active Directory? And if that is found to be true, then ADFS will issue a token and tell Office 365, yes, these credentials are correct. Whereas in password sync, and the feature kind of tells it, will actually synchronize the hash of your password into Office 365, and whenever you try to authenticate against Office 365, it will look up in its own database, hey, the hash of the password I have here, is it the same as the one that's being presented to me here? And if it is, it will just authenticate you without connecting to the on-premises ADFS environment.
Very good. Next question is, how difficult is it to set up Mailscape for monitoring?
Oh, actually, it's pretty simple. It takes roughly about half an hour to get the tool up and running and get live, useful information out of it. So it's pretty simple, though.
Very good. Next question. We have time for a few more. How long do you recommend staying in a hybrid environment?
Oh, Well, there's no real recommendation here. There is no need to stay in for just a month or stay in for years. It all depends on your own environment and what your bigger plan is. As I said earlier in the presentation, if you're just looking to move mailboxes to the cloud, then probably you're going to stay in the hybrid environment until all your mailboxes got moved and you validated that everything is working as required. However, you could keep that same hybrid deployment up and running just in case if you wanted to start offboard people again and move them back on premises, kind of to have a backup plan. However, there is a drawback if you take that approach because you'll still need to, manage that hybrid environment even though you don't have anything on premises and need to update those servers. So there is a certain, effort and cost involved. But typically the answer here is, depending on the bigger plan behind what your goal is. If you're going to have mailboxes on premises indefinitely because you cannot move them to the cloud, you don't want to move them to the cloud, then you'll probably be running hybrid for a pretty long time.
Very good. Next question, one of our observant participants says, I noticed that one of the slides on the deployment process had the word certificate in it. Does that mean the product monitors certificate expiration?
Yes, it does. I think I didn't show that, but no, the tool actually gives you for the different certificates, Auto Discover, Web Services, ADFS, it will check the certificate and report back the expiry date. So as long as you're far from the expiry date, you're good to go, but as soon as you get closer to the expiry date, it will start giving you a warning, a threshold that you can configure, and obviously once it's expired, it will throw a warning.
And we have a participant asking if you can talk about how reliable you find Office 365 to be.
Well, I find it very reliable, and that's just because it is. Not too long ago, Microsoft published their reporting on availability, and I think they managed to pull 99.95% uptime over a year, which is an extremely high number. It's something that's very difficult to achieve on premises. So I'd say, yeah, they're pretty reliable, and from my own experiences, yeah, they definitely are.
Well, very good. And we'll need to wrap up with that question in order to stay on schedule for our next breakout session. So on behalf of msexchange.org, I want to thank Michael and all of you for joining us today. And we want to thank eNow for helping make it possible for us to bring you today's event. Don't forget to join us at the next breakout session that will begin immediately following this one. And it's the link for that is available in your confirmation email. And it can also be found at the Twitter hashtag Office365EXCHCON. That's hashtag Office365EXCHCON. Thank you all again for joining us, and you may now disconnect.